Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, so thanks everybody for coming. And uh, let's go to the next slide. So I think the next slide, yeah, just um, there are a group of us who wrote a report in November, which was submitted to Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur, when she made a request for the role of private companies worldwide in the genocide. And there's a substantial group of researchers, um, mostly young students, who worked on the report. Um, and Due to the kind of doxing and harassment is happening with this particular issue and genocide, Um, many of them are not have chosen to be anonymous, and since I've written on this before, I started writing about issues for Science for the People 40 years ago, particularly about the military role. Um, and uh, um, so it's and on this particular issue, I've done a couple of exposés. One was a script for a video that the Breach ran in April of 2024. I should say that that was because it was an article I wrote in January of 2024, which I submitted to 20 different publications, including left-wing publications that had never rejected anything I've written, and nobody would publish it. So eventually I went to the Breach and we did a video. I also did the expose on gas tops for the Breach in September. I should say as well about uh, that's the kind of work us amateurs can do, um, because many of the some there's some paid researchers who hadn't found out that there was a sole source supplier, and we'll get to that in a minute. Let's go to the next one. This is just a piece of history about when I was first writing. And this again reinforces the point I'm going to be making about how basically, and this is not to be an insult to any of our co-authors or other researchers, but almost anybody with a grade 9 education and a laptop can do this work. Originally, I think I was, when I first found an article like this on the front page of the Globe and Mail, and as I say below, I sent it to Chomsky in '83. He actually then, in the old days of post, I mailed it to him. He mailed me back, and then we spoke on the phone. He actually attempted to find this article anywhere in a U.S. paper, and it never appeared, but it appeared on the front page of the Globe, and it was a key study. And if you, just for context, at this point, the United States was principally focused on preparing for counterinsurgency or supporting counterinsurgency and war in Central America, and arming Europe, preparing for a first strike nuclear war against Russia. And yet, at this point, the military-industrial complex had already turned its attention to the Middle East, predicting that there would be a war in the Middle East that the U.S. would have to fight by the year 2000, 17 years later, which actually came about. So it's partly to say much of the work we do, as Chomsky said on numerous occasions when we brought him to Canada on speaking tours, a lot of the work that goes on is by unnamed people who you'll never hear about who do really important work. And that includes all of us. And so that's a way of just, I hope, encouraging all of us to do whatever we can. Let's go on to the next slide. We'll go through these pretty quickly. The U.S. is basically, if you look at its budget, it's basically a giant military industrial complex, the biggest one the world has ever seen. The vast majority of public funding goes to military and various forms of violence. Um, so this is what the U.S. does, and it has a bit of some social programs on the side, but basically it's a giant military industrial complex in order to take stuff from other places and other peoples. And the most important stuff it takes is oil, fossil fuels, in order to fuel its all its various programs and what it does. So let's go to the next slide. Um, Now, the part that's important here is that although the US is the biggest military industrial complex, what we don't often talk about is who's the biggest parts supplier to the biggest military industrial complex, and that's Canada. For the longest time, and although they've now started hiding the statistics, but since 56, since the Defense Production Sharing Agreement was signed, Canada, I mean, we're basically the biggest neighbor, we're the biggest trading partner, but we're the biggest arms supplier to the US in terms of parts for the weapons they use. So this, in a way, we're the second most important country in the world in terms of our impact on the US military industrial complex and what they do. As I've often said to people, and maybe it's too flippant to say, but if the biggest military industrial complex was Guinea-Bissau, we wouldn't have that much effect on it, and it wouldn't be that easy for us to do things about it. But as Che Guevara said, we live in the belly of the beast. So we're the fortunate ones. We're in the place where we can apply the most pressure. Let's go to the next slide. This is just this is sort of the first section. There's three parts to this overview. This is a bit on U.S. involvement or support for Israel, which is the biggest the biggest amount of military aid the U.S. sends and has done for decades is to Israel. The second highest amount is to Egypt. Let's go to the next slide. And then in addition to military aid to Israel, there's the use of U.S. military force, which is this first table here, when they assign aircraft carriers to a region and so on, the amount of U.S. military force devoted to that region. And again, as one British journalist said several years ago, if the principal export from the Middle East was turnips, none of this would be happening. It's always has been and is about oil. And by the way, I want to do a shout out. If you're on Twitter, following Stephen Semler, he does the best organized research on the military industrial complex and most succinct and most clearly explained. He does great work with tables. Next slide, please. This is just a simple explanation about why this isn't a war. A war is between two military forces. This is a genocidal attack and on a resistance force group community of people that are occupied and resisting an ethno-state and apartheid. Let's go to the next slide. So this is the first piece of research I've done for the current intensification of this genocide, because it's been a long-term attempt to ethnically cleanse Palestine by the Zionist groups, and starting over 70 years ago. So this video, a couple minutes long, was what I mentioned came out of the article I wrote that no one would publish. So we turned it into a script. And this first came out in April with excellent work done by the videographers of and staff at the breach. I don't have it loaded here, but you can find it if you haven't seen it. Let's go to the next slide. And I'll just mention from that, you probably saw the note, but after we published that, and I worked with other arms researchers in Australia and England, and all the websites, after we all began doing this work, particularly after that one came out, that video, Lockheed Martin, the maker of the F-35, then deleted almost 80% of the information about Canadian arms suppliers. Luckily, we have web archives, so we were able to track it. And also, some of us had done a lot of work before they deleted everything. Here are some of the F-35 critical parts suppliers. There have been about 100. That's now winnowed down to about 70 as the key suppliers who do the best work for Lockheed have been selected. And here we're focusing on 8 really important ones, and I'll even narrow that down further. And we'll get into some detail on these. But this is the role that Canadian companies are playing with this particular weapon. We're not talking about all the weapons that the US uses. along with Israel in Palestine because the attack on Palestine and the genocide of Palestinians is a joint Western endeavor. It's a joint U.S.-Israeli attack, and it's funded and supported by critical work from the main Western powers, particularly Canada, the UK, Australia, France, Italy, and Germany. Let's go to the next slide. This is just some of the companies that are making parts for the F-35. Let's go to the next one. And these are some of the countries involved. So this is a worldwide web of work that's going on, a vast supply chain, as you can see. And in the top right is just a handful of the companies that are involved in Canada. In the center is the map of the United States and the construction, the factories involved in making parts, all of which is basically assembled in Fort Worth, Texas. I've crossed out Turkey because at the behest of Israel, Turkey was not allowed to have F-35s and was removed from the program. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so why is this particular weapon important? Because Israel decided in 2014 to primarily use fixed-wing aircraft in order to pummel and pulverize and destroy Palestine. It kind of shifted from a strategy of using ground forces and artillery and decided it would just use as much as it could Air Force bombing in what it calls playing billiards with a bowling ball, just destroying everything. This is not, this has been its focus uh, for over 10 years. And a key to this is the F-35 jet. It began procuring in 2017. It was the first Air Force to fly the F-35 outside of the United States. And 2 months ago, it announced that, or 3 months ago, it announced on Twitter, and we'll get to this. This is important. That it had flown 15,000 flight hours with the F-35. But you can see this is an article from 2015 about why these F-16s, F-15s, F-35s are so important to bombing all this urban environment. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm not going to go into this. It's too horrific. And you folks are here presumably because you've also seen and heard too many horrific things to bear, basically. But these 2,000-pound bombs, it's important to explain, which you've heard about, which the F-35 is dropping along, and so are the other jets Israel flies. There, up until this conflict has completely changed the rules of attack on resistance forces. Um, the United States, this fellow who admits, J.P. Alfred on this broadcast, who confesses to be a Trumper and a Republican, but he's horrified by the use of these bombs on Palestinians, saying that this, even for all the war crimes, he and the other co-hosts of this podcast, they admit for all the war crimes the U.S. has committed in Afghanistan and Iraq recently, amongst a long list of others, he said this just would not be allowed by a U.S. military. So that they just wouldn't drop these bombs and on these populations. In fact, as he says at the end, everyone involved, the commander, the sensor operator, the pilot, the lawyer at JAG who approved it, they would all be in Leavenworth prison if the U.S. had done that. That's his view. Let's go. And before I go, um, I want to say that the reason these bombs are so terrible on young people and children is their bodies just aren't as strong, and essentially the overpressure from the bombs squeezes their lungs so hard it blows their heads off of children, which is why there's so much decapitation, which is just a horrific thing to hear about. I'm sorry I mentioned it, but this is the reality of what these bombs are doing. So contrast that as Stoker, who's did 4 tours of duty in Afghanistan and only can recall one time the US used a 2,000-pound bomb against a hardened bunker site. And here, even it just in the first 5 weeks, Israel had dropped 600 of them on Gaza. And the US had to reload Israel multiple times with 2,000-pound bombs because they just kept running out. They were just dropping them on everything. Let's go to the next. One of the times that we know of now that we can directly link a war crime to the F-35 jet is the July 13th, 2024 strike on tents in the Al Mawasi, essentially beach area, safe zone, which killed 90 and injured 300. It was a horrific war crime, and Israel, with the collaboration of the U.S., dropped 8 2,000-pound bombs on the Al Mawasi tent camp. And an Israeli official admitted to the Danish publication Information on September 1st that it was F-35s and admitted that the number of 2,000-pound bombs used. So we have a direct connection now to a war crime, which makes every part that Canadian companies ship makes us complicit with this direct connection. And because of the Canadian law, which forbids the export of parts to conflict regions where war crimes or violations of international humanitarian law are being committed. Let's go to the next slide. Who's committing the war crimes? These are the men committing the war crimes in this photograph. These are photographs from the Israeli Air Force Twitter feed and its supporters. Um, and that's the F-35 in the top right. There it is again in the bottom right. Those are the 2,000-pound bombs. That's what they look like. And behind the men, that is an F-35 Israeli, US, Canadian-made jet. Let's go to the next slide. Who are the Canadians committing the war crimes and complicit? These are some of them at an earlier CANSEC security conference in Ottawa. These were some of the men involved in making the parts and who are now complicit in war crimes. Let's go to the next slide. What has Canada done when in other comparable situations, which are not really comparable at all because Russia's attack on Ukraine has not produced anywhere near the kind of death and destruction and human death toll that the US-Israeli attack on Palestine has. But here's an example. You can go to the Global Affairs Canada website and you'll see there are 64 sets of sanctions on Russia, all sorts of freezing of assets. Explicitly focusing on making sure not a single part gets into a Russian weapon used anywhere. Additionally, within a couple of weeks, Prime Minister Trudeau had referred to the attack on Ukraine as genocide, and Canadian officials refused to use that word at all in what's obviously more appropriately called a genocide in Palestine by the US and Israel. But this shows the width of the sanction regime and breadth and detail that can be exerted by Canada when it chooses to do so. Let's go on to the next slide. Now I'm going to switch a bit to just a part of the explanation about what's going on here and what we can observe. This is actually a bit of new information that hasn't been published yet. And this is about the relationship between Israel, Lockheed, the United States, and Canada, and the manufacture of these weapons, and how Lockheed is using this war to help sell jets. Now, the F-35 is a controversial weapon. It's largely critiqued even by right-wingers in the United States because many studies, including this one, which is heavily redacted, you see on the right, but was obtained by a program on government oversight. The Project on Government Oversight, POGO, it's called, published this, and essentially the F-35 in all the best case scenario testing in domestic non-conflict settings in the United States is only available 50 to 60% of the time they can get it airworthy. And this was super critical and suggesting that the program is way too expensive. It's the most expensive weapon system in US history. It's over $1 trillion. It's much more expensive than an aircraft carrier, the overall program. And essentially, it's not really a very good jet, is what these studies are saying. Let's go to the next slide. Anthony Lowenstein is the one who's profiled or talked about this. If you don't have his book, I suggest you get it and have a look at it. Let's go to the next slide. Because what he's explaining is how uh, the U.S. is testing weapons on Palestinians in order to help sell them. As I said at the outset, the U.S. is essentially a military industrial complex. It wants to sell weapons worldwide. To do so, it needs to test them on living populations, and it's using the Gaza conflict to test them. So if you'll notice, in February, that study came out saying the F-35 really doesn't work very well. So what happens? The U.S. head of logistics for the F-35 comes out less than 2 months later and says, with a complete list of how well the F-35 is working, uh, destroying Palestine and murdering Palestinians, with a detailed list of how often it's available. And he's claiming, or they're claiming, that essentially the fleet of 39 jets, 37 out of them are airborne every day, at least 2 to 3 times, 2 to 4 times per day, bombing Gaza. Now, that's an extraordinary success rate, or what you might call, or like a turnaround rate, which completely conflicts with the reports done in domestically in non-conflict situations in the United States. Nobody's been talking about this, but essentially, I'll show you another pattern of this. You begin to see a pattern where critical studies come out in the US saying the thing doesn't work. And within weeks or sometimes days, Israel, with the collaboration of Lockheed, pulls out information saying how well the jet is working and it's doing all these things. Let's go to the next slide. So now let's talk. We'll shift to Canada now, and these are the Canadian companies. The three or four we're going to highlight are the biggies, the ones doing the most to put these F-35s in the air. Essentially, if they're not sole source suppliers, they form Achilles heels in this program because they just produce such high quantity of parts in critical places for the jet. Uh, let's start off with Magellan. If you look at the back of that jet, you'll see their horizontal tail fins. Half of all the horizontal tail fins on the conventional version of the F-35 are made in Winnipeg by this company. This company now, I believe, I'd have to check my notes, but I believe is now owned by a Swiss conglomerate. Let's go to the next slide. This is the one that might affect you in Montreal the most, and you're probably aware of it. Haru DevTech is a sole source, we think is a sole source supplier because there's a YouTube video in French of the president saying that the entire supply line will depend on Haru DevTech supply line of F-35s for landing gear. And so it's probably a sole source supplier. It has two factories, one in Longueuil making landing gear and one in Laval making door locks for the jet. Let's go to the next slide. Critical also is this company, ASCO. They received $47 million worth of taxpayer money to create the forges necessary to build these titanium bulkheads, which is essentially the spine, the central piece upon which the wings and the fuselage are attached to the jet. There are only 4 places in the world that make this, and with the lot numbers and supply schedule, we can see that ASCO is making the bulkheads for the jets that are going to Israel. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is the sole source supplier. There's no one else in the world that makes these parts. 3 of these sensors are inside the engine of every F-35. It's unique patented technology that is actually, in terms of the workforce, only 20 or 30 people's income depends on this. There's only 20 or 30 people making this part in an Ottawa factory, but this part is critical to the jet. And if it wasn't made or the government forbid it from being shipped across the border, the production line would come to a standstill. Nobody makes anything quite like this. Let's go to the next slide. Here's another picture of the part. And let's go to the next part. Next slide. Here's a picture of this is a different version of the jet, but so I've crossed out the lift fan, which isn't in the Israeli version, but this is Gastop's own slide showing where three out of the four slide sensors go on this jet. Let's go to the next slide. This is the research that we did at the breach, Lucy Martin and I, finding that there was a sole source supplier that could disable the use of this jet if the part wasn't provided. Let's go to the next slide. And Gas Tops started at Carleton. Engineers from there started the company. Its majority of its work is for other types of aircraft. Um, but it does do this critical work that we could stop it doing. And it does recruit um, from engineering programs, principally in Ottawa and Montreal. Let's go to the next slide. This is a picture of a protest that happened after we published in November. That's Gas Top's building in the background on Polytech Drive in Ottawa. Let's go to the next slide. This also happened afterwards. There was a group, we don't know who, but who disabled the factory. And reports, unconfirmed reports were that the factory was disabled for 2 weeks by direct action by people who are unknown to us, but that happened after the information was published. Let's go to the next slide. This is why it matters, the parts from Canada. This is the general running the F-35 program in the United States, speaking before Congress. I watched a 2-hour video of his testimony and the other Lockheed individuals, and he admitted that because the F-35 relies on just-in-time manufacturing, if the part doesn't arrive on time, everything comes to a standstill while they wait for it. And anything like labor action or protest that slows down the arrival of the part impairs the use of this, the building of this weapon, and stops it from being shipped. Let's go to the next. This is just to show that the F-35 was also being used over Lebanon in the type of bombings we saw yesterday. And the reason we know this, as numerous lawsuits in the United States can attest, is that the F-35s have a unique sound signature. They're very loud. And even communities that have other types of jets in the United States stationed there have sued to stop the F-35 from being stationed near them because it's too loud. Let's go to the next slide. How do we find out what we find out? A lot of it we can find out directly from military sources that are public and open source info. This is an example of a Twitter user who's extremely popular and is very right-wing military enthusiast, but he's obsessed with the F-35 and publishes on it all the time, everything he can find. And a lot of the info is available just through people like this. Let's go to the next slide. And the other place we can find it is through the Quakers, the American Friends Service Committee, and the Canadian parallel, the Canadian Friends Service Committee. This is the Quakers peace organization. In addition to being a religious organization, they're very focused on peace, and they've published a really excellent series of guides and profiles of companies. That is a really good starting point if you're interested in finding out what's going on. Let's go to the next slide. This is the research I mentioned. I'm sorry, I'm going to go a little bit over on time. I just want to mention the new research we've done. This is where we're beginning to find now that the controversy about the F-35 is being countered by Lockheed and Israel, talking about how great the F-35 is. So Portugal and Canada, after Trump's tariffs, Portugal stopped its plan to buy the F-35, and Canada started rethinking the F-35, and this was March 13th. Let's go to the next slide. This is March 14th and 13th. Companies thinking they won't buy the F-35, or countries. Let's go to the next one. And what happens? Israel posts in Hebrew on its Air Force Twitter on March 16th that how great the F-35 is working. 15,000 hours, but also importantly here, and this is new information, a particular formation of the F-35, which allows it to carry more of these 2,000-pound bombs under the wings, has been developed by Lockheed uniquely, and Israel is the only Air Force, not even the US has it, that's flying the jet this way, which completely defeats its stealth capabilities because it's essentially a big lumbering um, uh, tractor carrying bombs now. Let's go to the next slide. And this Lockheed had envisioned this originally in 2017 and had called this style of F-35 beast mode. Let's go to the next slide. You can see the difference. That's it on the right. That's the amount of ordnance, bombs the F-35 can carry when it's in this mode. And it was originally envisioned to do this, but no one's ever done it before. Lockheed's only actually developed this capacity, which essentially quadruples the bombing ability of a single F-35 jet. It's only developed this for Israel for use in this conflict. And why? Let's go to the next slide. Because when it's in this mode, it has no stealth capacity and it can be shot down by anybody with any kind of surface to air or weaponry. Let's go to the next slide. And this beast mode then is very limited. You can only use it against enemies with no air defense at all. Let's go to the next slide. And as this retired Indian Air Force veteran told an online publication, there's only one place that Israel can safely use this, which is Gaza. It can only is basically to pummel an enemy with no air defense at all, and principally against civilians, men, women, and children, and hospitals and schools. Let's go to the next slide. So what can we do? This is just a deep dive into one particular weapon. There's a lot of military work going on across the country because, as I said, we are the main supplier of parts to the biggest military industrial complex in the world. The other part, let's go to the next slide, is something that hasn't really been looked at yet. Oh, and here's a map. This is an excellent resource if you haven't used it yet and gotten in touch with World Beyond War. They're a really important organization worldwide, but particularly in Canada. This shows many of the places making parts for the attack on Palestine. Let's go to the next slide. This one is what I was referring to. The United States depends overwhelmingly on Canada for minerals, particularly these three minerals, to make steel stronger and to use in the jets. This is overall, but particularly these three minerals are critical for making aircraft and, of course, and tanks and anything that uses metal. And the U.S. military-industrial complex would come to a standstill if Canada didn't allow these to cross the border to the United States. Let's go to the next slide. In addition, there are rare earth mineral elements that are critical. This is F-35 depends on these as well, and Canada ships those as well. Let's go to the next slide. So Palestine Action has drawn attention in the UK to all the different parts of the military-industrial complex that are vulnerable to pressure. As you've seen, if you've seen their videos, they don't merely go after arms companies. They go after the town councils that give leases to arms companies and allow them to be there. They go after landlords. They go after banks. They go after tech companies. They focus on all the different components of the military-industrial complex. Yeah, so this is just an idea of the range of research we could be doing on all the different vulnerabilities that the military-industrial complex has in this particular genocide, and that Canadians can influence. Let's go to the next one. We're wrapping up. This is the person who inspired me to take this direction and look this way. Claire Culhane had been a nurse in South Vietnam and was horrified by the U.S. attack on southern Vietnam during the Vietnam War. She wanted to go to the north, to the communist part of Vietnam and help out, but the ambassador there said, was appreciative when she asked, but he said, why don't you go to your own country and stop the bombs from coming? And at that time, if you go to Parliament, you'll find that the benches you sit on in the observation gallery no longer have legs on them. That's because of Claire. In the 60s, she would go to Parliament, sit in the observation gallery, chain herself through the legs of the benches, and throw leaflets into the MPs. And she was from Montreal, really important activist. And leaflets would say every B-52 bombing Vietnam has tons of Canadian nickel in it. We shouldn't be shipping that. So let's go to the next slide. I wanted to just leave on a note of or end this on a note uh, of importance about our creativity in our activism and organizing. This is just part of the list of 198 methods of nonviolent action that comes from Gene Sharp's book originally in the 70s. But what's interesting on this list is it doesn't include encampments. So the method that's probably most thought of as a direct action method, a protest method that's come up in the last year, was invented recently. And this is really important. There's an activist named Maya Dewar in the United States who says the words creative and reactive have the same letters in them. It's really important for our protest organizing and action that we're creative and not merely reactive. Let's go to the next slide. And this I take from an organizer from who was actually Canadian, who went to Nicaragua to study the revolution there in the 80s and came back and did a workshop and talked about what the Nicaraguans talked about in their revolution, the 5 parts of the revolution, and how we all have a part to play in organizing and resisting and confronting the empire and confronting colonialism, occupation, land theft, and apartheid everywhere. So there is, yes, there's armed resistance. And as the fellow jokingly said, the Nicaraguans admitted, yes, they tried to work within the legal system or an electoral system, but most of those people got assassinated. Really important for sustaining is community. And then, of course, education. All the cultural aspects that support our struggle are really critical. And then there's the healing aspect. Shamans, priests, witches, spiritual practices, medicine, that which sustains us to keep going. So let's go to I think we're into the last slide. I won't read this at length, but if you can, the Jadalia series on YouTube, which there's usually one a week, they're incredibly encouraging and supportive. And as one of the hosts, Jenan Matari, says, this is really about colonialism and land theft. And we have to tie these together, both here and overseas. And this is partly why the United States and Canada and the UK are so comfortable with Israel and what it's doing to Palestine, is because it's such an echo of what we're doing, have done, and in the Americas and Australia and Africa. So there we go. Let's go to the next slide. So this wraps it up. This is where you can reach us. And if anybody wants to reach out to me, I'm available by email. And the things I've written are on the academia website if you are interested. And I think that's it. Yeah, we're at the question and answer section.
I'm going to stop the recording at the moment.
Yeah, let's pause or stop the recording. That would be great.